Do you ever feel like your brain is on fire? Well, that might be because you are suffering from neuroinflammation. Neuroinflammation is present in a variety of conditions, including chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia. Also in mold illness, in stealth infection, in practically every neurodegenerative condition, and in more common conditions like depression. Some of the common symptoms might be severe fogginess. It might be fatigue or apathy or depression or heightened skin sensitivity, sensitivity to strange chemicals. It may be neurological symptoms, including dizziness or paresthesias. In fact, it can present in practically every system of the body. And some of the common causes that we will look at in today's video. First, stemming from the gut. This being if someone has gut inflammation, if someone has a condition called intestinal permeability, this can lead to neuroinflammation. Another really common driver is a condition referred to as chronic inflammatory response syndrome. This is people who get sick from exposure to mold, from exposure to biotoxins produced by underlying infections that they do not know that they have. And finally, some toxins which are ubiquitous in the environment, which we are all exposed to. These can also contribute towards neuroinflammation. But first of all, delving into how gut issues can lead to neuroinflammatory issues, well, we have to examine how this happens down at the intestinal level. And in the intestine, we have a barrier. For those who aren't aware, this is responsible for keeping out the bad stuff, the chemicals, the bacteria, the toxins, and allowing the nutrients to be absorbed properly. Unfortunately, there are many factors which can disrupt this barrier. When this barrier is disrupted, this is called intestinal permeability. Food sensitivities, inflammation in the guts from some kind of infection or some kind of microbial dysbiosis, nutritional deficiencies, environmental toxins that we've just been speaking about, even chronic stress, alcohol consumption. There are numerous things which are involved in breaking down the barrier or in inducing this intestinal permeability. This can include bacterial toxins such as lipopolysaccharide, such as metabolites, other chemicals, other proteins, peptides, things that are not meant to get into the bloodstream do. And the immune system detects this and initiates a systemic inflammatory response. At the same time, we also have a nervous system down in the gut. This is called the enteric nervous system, and we have dense bundles of neurons lining the entire GI tract. And these are responsible for detecting differences in information, different pieces of information, identifying the things that are going on in the gut and relaying that information to the rest of the body. And so these enteric neurons can be picking up on any changes that are occurring in the gut, including pro-inflammatory chemicals, bacterial metabolites. If someone has some kind of a dysbiosis, they're picking up neurotransmitters. And so these two systems working together through what is called the gut-brain axis, well, we have pro-inflammatory chemicals, inflammatory chemicals going through the blood, and we have information which is relayed through the nervous system via the vagus nerve. This is all getting to the brain. Well, that can have an effect on another barrier, and this other barrier is called the blood-brain barrier. Just like the intestinal barrier, this needs to be selectively permeable. But not only that, this is highly selective about what it allows in and out of the brain. This is because the brain is very sensitive to any kind of toxin. So it's really important to decide what comes in and what doesn't come in. Now, when we have this low level chronic inflammation coming from the gut, coming through the blood, cells on the brain side of the barrier called astrocytes can become activated. And what we can end up with is increased barrier permeability. Now, this is allowing chemicals and bacterial products, even bacteria, to enter into the space in the brain. And this is going to be triggering neuroinflammation. At the same time, we have information coming up from the gut. Remember, we were talking about the enteric neurons. They are coming in via the vagus nerve, and they are going to be activating immune cells in the brain, which are called microglia. Now, microglia become activated, and together these are contributing towards this overall state of neuroinflammation, so immune system activation in the brain. So these brain immune cells, microglia, not only start generating large amounts of reactive oxygen species, it also is responsible for releasing numerous different types of chemicals which contribute towards inflammation. These are called pro-inflammatory cytokines. Furthermore, we have direct release of a neurotransmitter called glutamate. Glutamate is referred to as an excitatory neurotransmitter. And the reason for this is because glutamate excites neurons. It stimulates activity, and it does this by binding with AMPA and NMDA receptors. Unfortunately, we can end up with excessive release of glutamate, and this is what happens in neuroinflammation. And this produces a condition called excitotoxicity. What this basically means is that the neuron is stimulated to such an extent that we end up with an excessive amount of reactive oxygen species being generated in the neuron, and it eventually ends up in cell death. With the massive amounts of reactive oxygen species that are being generated, there are damage to the cell membranes, damage to the phospholipids that make up the cell membranes. There is a depletion of the antioxidant molecules, including glutathione. Furthermore, because of the increased demand on every system, this increases the turnover and the demand for specific nutrients. So going back to these activated microglia, not only are they contributing to this inflammatory environment in the brain, but they also exert an effect on how we process an amino acid. This amino acid is called tryptophan. As many of you probably know, tryptophan is ordinarily used to make another neurochemical called serotonin, and ultimately that goes on to make melatonin. But there's an alternative pathway. Under conditions of oxidative stress and inflammation, well, tryptophan is diverted towards making a different chemical called quinolinic. And this goes on to make a neurotoxic compound called quinolinic acid. So quinolinic acid is indeed neurotoxic. It contributes towards the overall excitotoxic environment by stimulating neurons excessively, by damaging the fats that line the membranes, by contributing towards this overall oxidative stress, affecting our hormonal output, disrupting the HPA axis, and is also a key driver of neurodegenerative processes. In fact, quinolinic acid has been implicated in depression and other neuropsychiatric conditions, and reducing quinolinic acid via various means usually translates to improvement in symptoms. Furthermore, activated microglia also activate an enzyme called inducible nitric oxide synthase. This produces massive amounts of nitric oxide, which goes on to bind to different complexes in the mitochondria. One is called alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase. Another one is called cytochrome C oxidase. Both of these functions act to suppress mitochondrial ATP production. Furthermore, nitric oxide will go on to make a free radical called the peroxynitrate radical, and this will go on to cause massive amounts of damage to the brain, to the structures of the brain, and to how cells are functioning as a whole. Other toxins which also contribute towards this neuroinflammatory environment that have been identified in the literature include mercury, arsenic, cadmium, lead, and aluminium. There are environmental chemicals including different hydrocarbons, organophosphates, various pesticides. Industrial chemicals might include BPA, phthalates, persistent organic pollutants, and also specific pharmaceutical medications, particularly antipsychotics, have been shown to have extremely toxic effects on the brain. So the cells which are responsible for maintaining the immune response in the brain can exist in two states. This one involves the surveillance state, and the other one involves an inflammatory state. One is essentially cleaning up debris, and the other one is actively increasing the amount of inflammatory chemicals which are going on to cause damage to the rest of the brain. After an initial insult, such as traumatic brain injury, but also in cases of chronic neuroinflammation, one can end up with a state of microglial priming. What this essentially means is that these immune cells retain memory and they are primed for future threats. This means that people with a history of neuroinflammation likely need to work a lot harder to maintain a healthy brain. So I wonder, are many of these people suffering from chronic fatigue and depression? Or is it actually some kind of a sickness behavior in response to chronic inflammation? You see, researchers have characterized this quite well. And in chronic inflammation of the central nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system becomes hyperactive. There is a hypervigilance response in certain circuits in the brain, and essentially the rest of the body is told to conserve energy and withdraw to eliminate potential pathogens and heal wounds. It might be beneficial in the case of an infection to become chronically fatigued and depressed so that you can have the energy to repair and regenerate. The problem is, in our modern world, we have continued ongoing threats, continued inflammatory triggers, and how about we consider that chronic fatigue and depression could realistically be the body's way to try to protect itself. And next, this brings us to another very common driver of neuroinflammation. This is exposure to biotoxins. Biotoxins are toxins which are produced by living organisms. This can include mycotoxins, which are produced by mold and yeast. It can be the bacterial toxins produced by infections, which some people don't know that they have. This is often Lyme disease, Babesia, or Bartonella. Finally, some waterborne microorganisms can also contaminate water or contaminate seafood, which we then consume and absorb those biotoxins from. So to understand how biotoxins can cause problems for so many people, a brief look at how the immune system works shows that it's essentially a pattern recognition system. It needs to detect patterns which it would ordinarily associate with different types of pathogens. This is to effectively bind with it, neutralize it, and carry it out of the body to keep us safe. And so biotoxins fall under this category of pathogen-associated molecular patterns. Our immune cells bind with the biotoxins, bind with these chemicals, and this activates the innate immune system. Now, in a healthy body, the innate immune cells then present these biotoxins to other types of immune cells called adaptive immune cells. These adapt essentially by identifying the biotoxin, seeing it's a toxin, neutralizing it, and eliminating it from the body via the various means that it does. However, in people who are genetically susceptible, they have some kind of a polymorphism in their HLA sequence. Well, what ends up happening is that the presentation or the communication between the innate immune cell and the adaptive immune cell fails. And so what ends up happening is that the innate immune system remains active. The biotoxins remain in the system because they've not been identified and neutralized by the adaptive system. So for example, for someone who lives in a water-damaged building, they are being exposed to high amounts of mycotoxins on a regular basis. The one part of their immune system, the innate immune system, identifies that there's a problem. The innate immune system is active, meaning that there is inflammation. But unfortunately, that communication to the adaptive immune system fails. What this means is this person accumulates massive amounts of these toxins and has no way to effectively clear them out of the body. So for people who have this kind of problem, This is referred to as chronic inflammatory response syndrome. Eventually, you can end up with this inflammation affecting the brain. It affects one part of the brain called the hypothalamus. Excessive pro-inflammatory cytokines can damage receptor sites on the hypothalamus, which are meant to ordinarily bind a hormone called leptin. When someone becomes leptin resistant, it can be very difficult to lose weight. And this is one of the reasons why some people can be gaining weight, is because they are inflamed, because they do not have the action of leptin at the hypothalamus. They can't actually decide whether to store or to burn fat. Now, without going into too much detail, leptin resistance at the hypothalamus reduces the brain's ability to generate specific neurochemicals. A very interesting effect of this is that a lack of melanocyte stimulating hormone has numerous downstream effects on other parts of the body. MSH is needed to generate endorphins, and so this can mean that someone has chronic pain for no apparent reason. Think of fibromyalgia, for instance. Low MSH can also lead to low melatonin, and this can be one reason why someone can have chronic insomnia or sleep disruptions for no apparent reason as well. A lack of MSH leads to imbalances in other pituitary hormones. This might present as low androgens, including testosterone, DHEA. Another effect is low antidiuretic hormone for no apparent reason, which is going to affect the water retention. Someone may be chronically thirsty. They may not be able to retain the water that they consume, and they're always urinating. They've got frequent urination and excessive thirst, and they don't know why. In the initial stages, it's said to feature high amounts of stress hormones, so high cortisol, high ACTH, but eventually this will flatline and this will turn into the typical kind of adrenal fatigue scenario where someone has low ACTH and they have low cortisol. The issue is not in the adrenal glands. The issue is in the brain, and it's characterized by neuroinflammation. Furthermore, MSH is necessary for maintaining the intestinal barrier and promoting absorption of nutrients. And finally, it's responsible for calming down inflammation. And so someone can have long-term flu-like symptoms and an immune response when they don't necessarily have an ongoing infection. Some of the things that will occur in chronic inflammatory response syndrome: there is a pro-inflammatory chemical referred to as MMP9. It's an enzyme. This can increase the permeability of the blood vessels, but also it will increase the permeability of the blood-brain barrier. There can also be restricted blood flow, which reduces tissue oxygenation. This will then increase vascular endothelial growth factor, and this is going to ordinarily or ideally improve oxygenation. But this eventually will become depleted, and someone will be chronically hypoxic in many of their tissues. There are also high inflammatory mediators. One is called C4A, it's part of the complement system, and another transforming growth factor beta-1, TGF-beta. All of these factors contribute toward this low-grade systemic inflammation that's not going to be identified via ordinary testing. A useful way to identify whether this may be a potential problem for you is using visual contrast sensitivity testing. This is a very cheap test that can be done at home. It can be done, it takes about 15 minutes to complete, and there is a score that one gets after doing the test. Whether they pass or fail, they get positive or negative on the biotoxin section, can give a lot of material from which to investigate further. Furthermore, although ordinary blood work will not show whether someone has this kind of innate inflammatory response going on, there are specialized panels which look specifically at the following markers, and this is typically how it will look in someone who has this condition. To summarize, we've looked at the inflamed brain, or the brain on fire. We've identified that issues stemming from the gut, issues stemming from the digestive system, chronic digestive inflammation and intestinal permeability can drive neuroinflammation. We've also looked at how certain toxins have been identified in the research to contribute towards this problem. Finally, we've also looked at the exposure to biotoxins that some people have, and their body cannot effectively get rid of those. And what they are doing is they are driving the innate inflammatory response, and they cannot shut that down. The question is where to start. So first is to identify your individual root cause, and this is potentially going to be different for everyone. Next is to stop the ongoing exposure, stop the thing which is triggering or driving the inflammation. And finally is to address that cause. How to do that is way beyond the scope of this video. However, in the next video, there are very specific things that people can be doing to calm down the inflamed brain, to counteract neuroinflammation in various ways. Aside from addressing the root cause, to provide some extra support, first of all, we need to look at counteracting the excitotoxicity that occurs in neurons, reducing inflammation directly by modulating the inflammatory response, and improving how cells are generating energy, improving the stores of nutrients that cells need to be able to repair, to be able to replenish what's lost, and to support the endogenous antioxidant system. So make sure to tune into the next video because we will be going through exactly what those are.